To turn back to Eva Gorbooth's poems, we know Yeats was writing Easter 1916, 16 Dead Men and the Rose Tree in 1916 and 1917. So before this poem, Easter Week with Gorbooth, was published. So, it seems very likely Yeats hadn't read these poems when he's writing his own first 3 Easter 1916 poems. Nevertheless, we might enlighteningly recognise that Yeats's poems share in something with Gorbooth's. If not quite a poetic movement, then a poetic culture. Gorbooth's poems to her sister in prison were, though, published before Yeats's own poem about Markievicz in prison. So this is Gorbooth's poem. What has time to do with thee, who hast found the victor's way to be rich in poverty, without sunshine to be gay, to be free in a prison cell? Nay, on that undreamed judgment day, when on the old world's scrap-heap flung powers and empires pass away, radiant and unconquerable, thou shalt be young. This poem traffics less in tension and ambivalence than in transvaluation. Poverty becomes rich, a prison cell free, when dead one shall be young. It is again somewhat arresting, I think, in being kind of so condensed, so short, and also distinctly a kind of spoken poem, a poem that wants to be a printed voice. Once read, it is hard to quite read Yeats's own poem, in isolation, I think. So this is a poem that Yeats writes in late 1818 and early 1919, when Markievicz had been freed and pardoned, but then reinterred. And I think it's very hard for me now to read this Yeats poem other than relationally. Yeats's poem's attempt in its first stanza to see the Countess as altered to tranquility by her confinement, and indeed the later stress on youth in the poem, in the back of the poem, Yeats's poem, might be seen to run in parallel or dialogue with Gorbooth's poem. Yet this only makes Yeats's unsparing critique of Markiewicz's, as he sees it, bitter abstract politics, and Yeats's poem's evocation of Markievicz in her actual youth only the more striking and indeed rancorous. I mean, Yeats is not just offering a personal attack of people he had at various points been on very close terms with, but an attack on the companionable ameliorations of one sister's poem to another. So I think the stakes are high when he's writing this poem, but also, pointed as he is, critiquing Markiewicz's and, I think, by implication, Gorbooth's lack of lonely wildness in the present. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. And I think you've given us a great sense of kind of Yeats' kind of a dialogue with other poets that is happening there. I think, Vona, you're going to pick up from there.
As soon as I can find my PowerPoint.
As soon as you can find your slides.
Which I know they're on here someplace, but I just can't see them signposted.
Yeah, it will.
Thank you.
So, I think you're going to stand up for this.
I'm afraid I'll fall asleep.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I'll put myself to sleep with my own paper, so I thought I would just move around a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's me.
There you are.
Okay,
Good.
perfect. But okay, cool. Thank you very much. Okay, so I will need my little clicker thingamabobby. So I'm going to talk about Yeats in the context of contemporary poetry, contemporary writing, contemporary Irish writing. And we'll see how we get on. Last September, Yeats was in the running, you know what's coming, for some pretty fruity global news coverage, only tangentially to do with the centenary of his Nobel Prize award. Emmett Linder of the New York Times reported on September 13th, participants in next month's Dublin Marathon are due to receive a medal engraved with a quote attributed to W.B. Yeats. There are no strangers here, only friends you haven't met yet. Online commentators were quick to ask, did Yeats really say that? In this case, the attribution cannot hold. That's in the New York Times. The Guardian was a little more forthright, quoting Yeats Society Sligo director Susan O'Keefe, that there is no evidence of any kind that Yeats wrote those words. She went on to say, tongue-in-cheek, as far as any research can tell, he was not a known runner. His eyesight was very poor, so that might have stopped him. In response, Donald Clark of the Irish Times posted an article titled, "It's not Yeats," this is the title, "It's not Yeats on the Dublin Marathon medal, it's Marge Simpson, and you can quote me on that." The article claims that everyone has been admirably civilised about the pocket controversy. Everyone perhaps except Diarmaid Ferriter, who in his own Irish Times piece also quoted Susan O'Keeffe as saying, "To be misquoted is a sign of greatness, and that the error is a nice quirky oddity." Ferriter responds, "It is anything but. It is a travesty. Misattributing a quote makes a mockery of the award and the poet." The Dublin Marathon medal controversy, if that's what it was, shows clearly that our perception of Yeats is fluid and malleable. Published in 2002, the second part of Roy Foster's Yeats biography is subtitled W.B. Yeats, A Life, the Arch Poet. And as we all know, arch poets do not say, "There are no strangers here, only friends you haven't met yet." They would, to a man, put that "yet" where it ought to be, tucked in before "met," right? So it would read, "Only friends you haven't yet met." Something seems to have shifted, such that the public perception of W.B. Yeats allows it to be even remotely possible that he would write that quote. The triteness of its cliché seems to sum up something of our sense of the current standing of the poet, who is quoted so often and so widely in political discourse that it seems plausible for him to be considered a repository of any and all quotes, even ones as asinine as the example above. What seems to have happened is that W.B. Yeats has become the marketable face of Irish poetry, both his name and image instantly recognisable because subject to widespread use, used willy-nilly, one might say. He has been commodified, fixed as a stone in various marketing strategies, and as Geraldine Higgins at Emory has so comprehensively surveyed, in political speeches and utterances, while the current of Irish poetry might be said to flow around him to elsewhere. The rot may well have set in with the September 27th, 2017 sale by Sotheby's of what they termed a treasure trove of works from the Yeats family collection. It's not that there was anything inherently wrong with the sale, there wasn't. It's just that it's a little more difficult to parse as austere or arch. The man whose cigarette case and hairbrushes, etc., were out on view for any old mucker, and I admit I myself was one, to view, value, and possibly, if you were richer than I am, to bid upon, and even perhaps to own. If any such mucker, including myself, could own a piece of Yeats, then it's not much of a stretch to imagine a whole country also feeling as though he were now commodifiable property, to be bought and sold in the marketplace, to be literally available to the highest bidder. And commodifiable he certainly seems to be. If we can own his hairbrushes, then surely we can also own his words and bend them to whatever current needs we might feel need to be satisfied, whether they be marathon medals or stump speeches or, heaven help us, poems. Last year's Oxford Handbook to W.B. Yeats, edited by Lauren Arrington and Matt Campbell, included a final chapter by me titled Yeats and Contemporary Poetry, 12 Speculative Takes, in which I tried to situate Yeats in the context of preoccupations of contemporary poetry, eco-poetry, #MeToo, etc., the co-option of so many poets to academia, attitudes to form, concerns about race, gender and sexual identity, etc. One section proved controversial, section 5, entitled "In which W.B. receives a letter from a rape victim concerning Leda and the Swan." OUP considered cutting it, a move solidly and heroically resisted by Matt and Lauren. To my mind, that tussle, such as it was, reveals something important about the Academy's view of Yeats, namely that his work is not to be hauled into the gong-tormented sea of contemporary poetry, with its sectionalism and various crises arising out of identity politics. Instead, he's to be put, remaindered, one might say, up on the high shelf of academic examination. That puts him in a curious two-faced position, grabbed at by the mucky paws of politics and marketing, but also consigned to the rarefied air of academia. Neither fates would position him at the heart of the contemporary culture of poetry writing, which might be right and proper, but I think it's at least worth asking if it is, or if, in fact, his work continues to reverberate in works being written and published as I speak. One might expect a degree of iconoclasm when it comes to a so-called national poet over 80 years dead, and we wouldn't want his reputation to be handled with archival gloves alone. But still, I think one could be forgiven for being slightly shocked, as well as greatly amused, by Scottish poet Peter Manson, writing in his about-to-be-published pamphlet-length poem, Self-Avoiding Space-Filling Curve, and here's the 2 lines: "Now that my bladder's gone, I must lie down in a puddle of my own making." There may be good reasons why one generation wants to challenge a reputation apparently set in the cement of marketing strategies and heritage markers. But for the purposes of this paper, I thought I'd give an arbitrary and entirely inexhaustive survey of some attitudes of younger writers towards W.B. Yeats. I've deliberately written writers there because I want to include Sally Rooney, who did in fact publish 9 poems in The Stinging Fly between 2010 and 2015, the earliest of which sport tantalisingly Yeatsian titles such as Impossibilities, Cheer Graw, both published in 2010, and stretching the point a little, an account of vital clues which appear to you in a dream, as well as later poems that strike a more quotidian contemporary note such as It Is Monday. But despite her career as a fledgling poet, I think we can agree that she's better known as the author of 3 novels. The first of which, 2017's Conversation with Friends, contains this exchange between 2 central characters, Frances speaking first and her lover Nick. "He told me he loved Yeats. Can you believe that? I practically had to stop him reciting the Lake Isle of Innisfree in the bar." Wow, I feel terrible for you. "And the sex was bad. No one who likes Yeats is capable of human intimacy." In a 2017 interview with Hilary A. White in the Irish Independent, Sally Rooney is quoted, "I hate Yeats, she shrieks. A lot of his poems are not very good, but some are obviously okay. But how has he become this sort of emblem of literary Irishness when he was this horrible man? He was a huge fan of Mussolini, he was really into fascism, and he was in the Senate. He wasn't just this harmless weirdo who wrote poetry." But to be fair, a 2018 feature on Rooney, a much better written piece of article, a 2018 feature on Rooney by Lauren Collins in The New Yorker, which also questioned, rightly I feel, the use of the verb shrieks in White's interview, reported that Rooney had reconsidered her Irish Independent outburst. "Oh my God, that was so ill-advised, trashing Yeats," she told me, seeming more amused than chagrined. For World Poetry Day 2019, Katie Goh of Dazed Online magazine asked 11 US and UK poets about their favourite political poems. One respondent, Joelle Taylor, later the author of Cento, Conto, whatever you want, and other poems, which centres around the UK's underground lesbian scene and which won the 2021 T.S. Eliot Prize for Poetry, nominated 6 poems, including Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, Selena Godden's My Tits Are More Feminist Than Your Tits, and W.B. Yeats's Easter 1916. If it seems surprising to find Yeats islanded on the flow of political poetry, Taylor expands, reading Yeats as embodiment and exemplar of what happens or ought to happen in the political poem. All poetry is political at its heart, whether the poet chooses to write about flowers or the corrective rape of lesbians in South Africa. Politics is about choices, and if the poet is not some kind of revolution, then perhaps they are not a poet at all. Even if we're mindful of Ivan Boland's helpful claim in an Irish Times essay published in 2015 that his mapping of the relation between a durable lyric form and a vulnerable human experience remains one of the great formal achievements of poetry, we might find ourselves straining to think of Yeats as some kind of revolution, in Taylor's words, but certainly something about him continues to poke through the skin of contemporary poetry. Asked by Run Riot blog in 2012 who she would select to represent dead poets in a Living versus Dead Poets poetry slam, performance poet Kay Tempest answers, William Blake, Charles Bukowski, Christopher Logue, P.B. Shelley, and W.B. Yeats, fuck it, why not? Elsewhere, in what must be one of the most eclectic lists of poetic influences, she cites Yeats alongside Virginia Woolf and the Staten Island hip-hop collective Wu-Tang Clan. She doesn't say what of Yeats appeals to her, but I put money on it being something to do with full rhyme and metrical consonants. This tendency for poets to cite Yeats without specificity, or indeed without much care, is not unfortunately unique to spoken word. In a 2016 interview with Claire Schwartz in Tri-Quarterly magazine, Claudia Rankin said this of her collection Citizen. In Citizen, I was thinking about issues of class. I wanted Citizen to be the kind of book that could be on the coffee table with an art book, not just for its looks, but for the world that was in it, a world that includes the death of Trayvon Martin, as well as the tennis court, as well as highly valued pieces of art. I decided the book needed to be beautiful. Like Yeats, I needed to give birth to a terrible beauty. That Rankin misreads, I think, Yeats's line is interesting in that it shows a poet not writing in the lyric tradition, despite the subtitle of Citizen's an American lyric, nonetheless wanting to align herself with them. It's tempting to believe that his combination of political adherence and poetic utterance might have been his attraction for Rankin, but it's equally plausible that what he offers her is not much more than a handy catchphrase and a borrowed line of succession. But happily, it's not always so. Hannah Sullivan published her second poetry collection with Faber and Faber earlier this year. Although its title, Was It For This?, is taken, Sullivan states, from Wordsworth's The Prelude, I hear in it, of course, also an echo of the famous Yeats line from September 1913, Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? Another poem which also riddles history and historical determinacy in a way similar to what Sullivan does in relation to one of her book's examined subjects, the Grenfell Tower fire. Here I might also suggest that the translation of Grenfell Tower into poetry might lean into, howsoever slightly, the image of Yeats's tower at Ballylee, another physical structure which was translated into both image, as Sturge Moore's cover illustration for the tower in 1928, and poetic artifact, or as we poets like to call it, a poem. If I'm right about this, and I may not be, it poses the tantalizing possibility of contemporary poetry having internalized Yeats to the extent of him working subconsciously in poems and books of poems being published now. He also pops up in Alicia Dietzman's first collection, Sweet Movie, just out from Beacon Press in the US. Described on the back cover as a feminist approach to romantic and religious masochism, it's a formally diverse book, aesthetically alert and syntactically supple. This is the start of her poem, Miracles, subtitled with a line from Yeats. So I'll leave it up there for you to look at, but you'll see that one of the lines is italicized, caught in that sensual musical neglect, and you will recognize that as a Yeats line. And I suppose really the question is, what are we to make of this deployment of a line which reads in its natural habitat? You'll recognize it in here. And I won't linger on that because I'm going to assume that most of you will know that stanza already, so I'm going to go back to Dietzman and just note how she returns the sensual music back to the realm of the human from the natural world into which Yeats has walked the stanza. Her use of the word flesh lifts it out of Yeats's context and literally exposes it as her line 3 or line 5, depending on what you're counting. So it's not unadulterated, the Yeats phrase, but it's negotiated with, as it were. It's trimmed to fit. The trimming is not disrespectful, but it is utilitarian. The thematic concerns of the Dietzman poem are foregrounded at the expense of textual fidelity to Yeats's original, which might be as good a way as any to negotiate with the monolithic legacy of Yeats, or with poets such as Yeats, if there are any others, a kind of creative recycling or imaginative archaeological dig that brings up not the structure entire, but if it's lucky, gobbets of it, bits and bobs, to be repurposed in a novel context, a new kind of display case. And here he is again in Stephen Sexton's 2021 second collection from Penguin, Cheryl's Destinies, this time plopped foursquare in the rather surprising context of a recording studio collaboration with Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins, in a sequence titled Siamese Dreams for the Cloths of Heaven, which, the notes advise, was composed in collaboration with Georgie Hyde-Lees, who revealed to me the identity of one of her many communicators and the influence of the Smashing Pumpkins on the poetry of W.B. Yeats. That touch of mind-bending, time-travelling surrealism is not entirely at odds with the register of the writing in Some of a Vision, and something of the risks being taken here with metaphor and narrative proposition may be said to have been vouchsafed by that earlier joint creative experiment in imaginative possibility. But if Yeats is a character in the sequence, its poems do not imitate or borrow from him. I'm sorry that the writing on this is so small and hope that you can make out some of it, but I wanted to have, it seemed important to have the whole piece together, and that's how it came up. Okay, here's an example from 4 for the End, 843. I'll read it. I hadn't planned on reading it, but I'll read it because it's so hard to read there. This is what we would call a dream vision. Yes, but who is imagining who, Yeats? Delight makes all of the one mind, says Yeats. You have your songs and I mine, says Billy. But what's the metaphor you're looking for? A metaphor is only a person trying very hard to be understood at the edge of their imagination. I know I've been a dick to the band, Yeats. I haven't been myself for years, Billy. Perfection of the life or of the work. I hear your winter and I hear your rain. Through summer's heat and winter's cold, Billy, poetry, music I have loved, and yet, and the presentation is as it is in the book, with those serrated left-hand margins there. It isn't parody, nor is it craven subjugation, dismissal or confrontation, nor is it in any sense a deployment of poetic kid gloves or indeed asbestos gloves, put on to minimize any possible damage or interference. Instead, it's a serious project, if an inherently humorous one, to mine something of Yeats's legacy in a contemporary setting that frames a discussion about art and aesthetics and the responsibilities of the artist and the cost to them of those responsibilities in a way that is surprising, sure, but also surprisingly efficacious at asking, if not quite answering the question, what can Yeats possibly mean to us today? Recent Yeats-themed anniversaries, the 150th of his birth in 2015, the 100th of his Nobel Prize award that we're celebrating today, put him front and centre of the Irish public imagination, if there is such a thing. Such anniversaries tend to run along fairly well-greased lines. The public reading of the poems by politicians and celebrities keen to seem literate or poetic, the institutional emphasis on his legacy as a way to underwrite current projects and issues, attention paid, supplements or dedicated issues of journals, programmes about the kind of somewhat staid hurly-burly in which the marathon medal story seems like a godsend because it allows the pieties of received reputation to coincide with a gentle revisionism and the tension between the two to constitute a news story. Unlike many lyric poets, part of Yeats's ongoing relevance is his propensity for appearing to lean into and drawing upon the news of the day. His poetic forms may not quite recognise it as such, but Yeats's content, those sought themes, strain towards modernism and towards Pound's requirement that poetry be news that stays news. Of course, he's never literal. Yeats couldn't describe to save his life, so he trades in images that are both specific and ethereal enough to seem graphable onto current events and situations. Unlike many poetry tricks, this is the trick that still works. Here's war correspondent turned poet Tom Slay writing in 2015 about his third collection, Station Z, which draws upon his experience as a journalist in Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq and Libya. Yeats once said that the purpose of art is to hold in a single thought reality and justice. You read something like that and apply it to the hard facts of a country like Iraq, and it inoculates you against all kind of emotional falderall. Stephanie Burt seems similarly confident that Yeats is a good model for poets now, writing that he represents, in many ways, in many apparently contradictory ways, a channel to myth and a model of painstaking conscious craft, an obviously political poet who also cherished the private life, a throwback in some ways and ultra-modern in others. Perhaps it's those very contradictions that continue to fascinate. While some poets and teachers hold him up as a model of aesthetic bravura, others are less sure. Here's James Longenbach defending him, a little too defensively perhaps, in The Nation magazine. Recently, in a review of one young American poet by another, I found this statement: Yeats may be a distant and unlikely model for contemporary poets. Why? Because he is utterly devoted to craft, because he doesn't live in Brooklyn. In Ireland, of course, he still matters greatly, and not just as the sellable face of Irish poetry. I believe he's deeply embedded in the Irish poetic imagination. Skeptics may argue that this is true in much the same way that fossils are embedded in stone, but I believe that much contemporary poetry, Irish poetry, especially spoken word, could be said to hearken back to him, not usually in terms of form, but in terms of how poems might be imagined to galvanise national identity by articulating a more than personal, outward-facing public impulse. Is it ridiculous to suggest that contemporary Irish poetry still listens to, moves like, and learns from Yeats without needing to signpost his influence? Which reminds me of what Seamus Heaney wrote about Tour Ballylee, that post-1928, Yeats no longer needed to live in it, since he had attained a state by which he lived by it. I'd argue that contemporary Irish poetry lives by Yeats's idea of poetry, his quarrel, lyric self-sense and poetic line all run as ley lines or undercurrents through so much of what we do. Not all Yeats, of course, not the pose struck, for example, in the opening lines of Lapis Lazuli. I have heard that hysterical women say they are sick of the palette and fiddle bow. Hysterical women, you wouldn't get away with now. You wouldn't dream of trying to get away with it now unless you were deliberately setting out to offend. But so much remains of value, as the engagements cited above suggest, I hope. Annoying, perplexing, lax, vivid, relevant, calcified, preponderant, inescapable, misquoted. We read Yeats mainly and really, I think, because he could write beautifully. Not always, and maybe not even as often as is supposed, but the best of him is still so much better than what most of us can write. And that's why I'd argue so many of us still tussle with that Yeatsian heritage. He's too good to be simply ignored, but also stuffy or dated or clunky enough in places at times to give us a foothold from which to try to climb up in the hopes, I suppose, that one day we might look him in the eye. Thank you.
Vona, I think one of the things you've done there so brilliantly is kind of crystallize something that's been kind of percolating through the conversations here today and kind of ties in with the last panel as well. And that is the question of how, I suppose, the image of Yeats almost makes it difficult to see the work. You know, and that kind of that relationship between the image and the work. And I was struck also, Tom, with your paper, you know, where you're talking about, you know, just how prolific Yeats was in that period, you know, leading up to the Nobel Prize, but also immediately after it. You know, and here he is, you know, he just moved into a new house in Marion Square, he was a senator, he'd won the Nobel Prize, and he's churning out all this poetry. I mean, it really is a kind of remarkable thing, isn't it?
It is. I mean, maybe not as remarkable as 750 euros for a letter. I thought, no, I mean, I think he's really, I mean, it is, you know, that, we talk about kind of different periods of Yeats, but, you know, a lot of the poems that come in the Tower do actually come in that period as well. So even though the Tower was published a few years later, there is like a real kind of, you know, if you go from the Wildest Swans of Cool through to the Tower, but most of which is written by about 24/5. Yeah. You know, or a lot of it, you know, that's pretty, you know, and when I think that is still, if someone's, that's the poems you're going to take with you, you're going to make other people read when you read Yeats. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is certainly the case. I mean, just to go back to your previous point about the presentation, I mean, I think the difficulty is also he's an arch self-present, you know, presenter of himself. So, you know, that's you can't get rid of that. You can't do the new critical thing and say, well, we're going to get rid of the self with Yeats, because I mean he's making that impossible for you. So it's kind of really which Yeats. I mean, I was thinking about all these, you know, which Yeats you choose. There's so many Yeatses to choose. So, you know, Sally Rooney can choose her Yeats. But actually, Yeats, I'm not. Yeats is fine. You know, there's plenty of other Yeats, and Yeats is going to do fine. You know, so that's okay.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Can I just say as well,
Yeah,
in relation to all this, wasn't he great that he found time to write poems? What else was he doing? You know, George was doing all the grunt work of keeping the show on the road.
Yeah.
And I know he was writing letters and he was getting involved in bits and pieces, but, you know, like really comes back, what else would he be doing? His whole life was being organised by somebody else for him. So, you know, I think we need to remember that as well.
Yeah.
It's not like he was cooking the spuds and, you know.
I suppose it just struck me as almost a bit of a paradox that sometimes the things we do to honour poets put things in the way of us seeing them and perhaps of them actually writing poetry as well.
Yeah.
It's
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody pays you to write a poem. Nobody wants you to write a poem. You write it at your own risk.
Yeah.
People will pay you to do other things, but nobody pays you to write a poem.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about the Nobel Prize and what impact it has on a person writing poetry. I mean, I know we have somebody with us here who's been close to that process, Mary Heaney. Do you want to say a word on that, Mary? I mean, what was the effect when Seamus won the Nobel Prize? Did it make it easier, or?
I asked him that because he was inundated with mail. Sorry. I did once say to him, because it made a huge difference to how he was known and the mail, and he was anxious about it. And I said to him, well, listen, are you glad you got it, or are you not? And he said, yes, I am glad that I was recognised like that, but it's like a mostly benign avalanche hitting you. And that sort of said it all. It gave him very little time for anything else, and it obsessed other people, and so it was hugely important in terms of how he lived the rest of his life. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks very much for that. I want to open it up because we have lots to think about from these panels. Martin, you want to? Yeah,
Very brief observation. I mean, both the Minister for Finance and his predecessor, now Minister for Public Expenditure, took a line out of an apocalyptic poem, "The centre holds," as a sort of motto and boast of government policy. But I think it should also be said that today, Seamus Heaney has joined him as being very much quoted by politicians. You know, the hope and history rhymes being, the favourite line. But I mean, there are others, and I think both of them have a useful function in public discourse in that regard, to show that politicians are a little bit more cultured than they seem.
Is it a good thing or a bad thing, politicians using lines from poetry, the poet's perspective?
I can see why they do it. I agree with you that mostly they do it to sort of make themselves seem as though they know about these things. It does isolate individual lines, which, they're not written that way. They're written to be part of a poem or a play. So I'm not sure that it does the work any great favours, really. I mean, I mentioned Geraldine Higgins in my talk, and she's done like loads of work on usage of Yeats in politicians' speeches. And she gave a talk recently for the National Library, and at the end of it, I asked her anonymously on the chat, I said, are there any quotes by Yeats that you think should be quoted more often, instead of all the same ones that get trotted out over and over again? And I think somebody mentioned one earlier. Somebody had a really good one earlier, but you do get tired. They do lose their impact. They do become cliches.
Yeah. Which is the danger. They become a cliche, and then you can't see them as poetry.
Yeah.
They become something
Exactly.
else.
Yeah.
I think, though, that what it says is it says both the centrality of poetry in Irish life and the importance of poets. Because to kind of circle back to the question in the previous panel, why did Yeats disappear in France? Well, I think Yeats disappeared in France because poetry disappeared in France.
Right.
And
these traditions that we have in Ireland, where poetry is nurtured, where there's a poem in the Irish Times every Saturday, where poetry is viewed as a living art, and which is treated with great respect. I think that. No, I can see Vona looking at me. I mean, obviously, my main point of comparison is France, but it is a huge difference.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose what I would say to that is, but Yeats is also quoted, particularly in the current American politicians, very keen on quoting Yeats, which kind of complicates that picture. I mean, I think it tells us that Yeats is very good at writing like aphoristic, memorable phrases. I mean, I think what we're kind of getting at with the tension, Yeats kind of in the poems, like that's always in dialogue with a lot of other stuff, and often very kind of obscure, odd, disturbing stuff. So I think generally the poems kind of earn that right, or they complicate that utterance. But obviously in political discourse that doesn't happen. So I think it is. I suppose I would rather. I think it tells us something about the way Yeats's poetry works as well, that it does lend itself to this. But I mean, and also I think Yeats, again, I think the poems that thought about this ahead of it, his poetry's already thought about the difficulties of these kinds of utterances, and the way that these kinds of utterances are always to be qualified, and are always kind of, to be undercut. So I think, and I think that happens to himself. He'll say something, but actually other bits of him are better, or are kind of are complicating that all the time.
Yeah.
So I think, his poetry is this kind of incredible thought machine and language machine that is kind of, he's he's going to be okay. There are other Yeatses, that kind of line.
Yeah, yeah. That it's almost when you put the lines back in the poems, they rejuvenate, they come back to life.
And one thing I will say about the usage of lines and phrases outside of their original context is that I don't really think people like poetry all that much. I think they need an excuse to like poetry, and sometimes that's an excuse. They hear Bill Clinton quoting somebody, they hear Joe Biden, and it's an excuse to kind of like poetry for a nanosecond.
I think we have two down at the back here first.
Sure.
You've got the mic there. I suppose, yeah. Well, you've got the mic first, then we have...
I just wanted to say, as someone who had to write speeches over the last 40 years, quite a lot, and it was always great to be able to find a quotable quote that you could stick into the speech. It made your speech, elevated your speech somewhat from the sort of quotidian level, which is great. But the other thing I wanted to say is that it's not just the political speeches. And by the way, whenever I heard Joe Biden quote Yeats, I always felt good when I was ambassador. It always gave me a kind of a lift. My day was a little more pleasant when I heard Yeats being or Seamus Heaney being quoted by Joe Biden as he often does. And I used to send over collections of Irish poetry every now and then to a speechwriter, just to kind of because they were always looking for new poets to delve into. But the other thing, of course, is that it's not only politicians. It's also think of the number of books that have titles inspired by Yeats. I mean, I think it must be in the hundreds, maybe thousands at this stage. I mean, I went into the big bookshop in New York last year when I was living there, and I think on the front table I saw 5 books that had Yeats. I mean, there's even a history of an economic history of the 20th century. It was called Slouching Towards Utopia. Right?
Yeah.
Clearly coming from Yeats. It was, and so I think that's something that there's something about the power of language. I mean, and Seamus Heaney is the same. Like the number of, the far side of revenge. I often quote the line, "A farther shore is reachable from here." This is something that all of us must hope is the case after all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks very much, Dan. We have time for 2 very quick questions. A lady at the back, and then Patrick in front.
Thanks very much for all of that. And as the Susan O'Keeffe quoted in those quotes, Vona, for which thank you, it was rather entertaining because Yeats Society Sligo, of which I'm the director, we were running the Nobel Centenary Programme at that time. And obviously, you're always vying for publicity. Well, dear Lord, dear Lord, could we stop it? In fact, one evening when I was going to bed, my husband said, oh, you know, it'll be the New York Times and the Guardian the next day for sure. And lo and behold, it was. And I was just laughing at the other end of the phone at this stage, going, guys, we want to talk, but no, we don't talk about the Nobel Prize. But the interesting thing is that in making that point about only really famous people are misquoted, is true. It is a mark of your greatness if you are misquoted. And all the great people, you know, all the sort of shining Abraham Lincoln and William Shakespeare and Marilyn Monroe and anybody you care to mention, Mark Twain, the list goes on and on. Just Google it and you'll find out you're overwhelmed with it. And you'll discover, of course, you've been misquoting people too. So it was, I think, rather entertaining. But of course, the story came out after that on the reverse of the medal, they'd said for the award of the Nobel Prize, N-O-B-L-E, and that got completely swept away. But in going back to that whole idea of commodifying Yeats as well, we were, as part of the programme, we thought, what would we do by way of, should we make something for it? Should we have something to sell? Should there be something to commemorate at the centenary of the Nobel Prize? And in the end, the one thing we did do was we made a broadside of the Song of Wandering Aengus, which is the poem that some of the judges referred to at the award, and also because it is one of the poems that people know. And we didn't do anything else. We had absolutely no merchandise of any kind, and that was a conscious decision that we would not descend into that whole area. And in fact, when I was chairing the Yeats 2015 programme, and Meg Harper behind me here was on the steering committee, we had the same decision to make about whether we would merchandise, because there had been all sorts of weird and wonderful merchandise, and there was, even for the centenary of the Easter Rising, there was rock, you know those sticks of rock you have for kids, with Easter 1916 on them. So I was very glad we hadn't gone down that route, but it is a very, very easy route to go down. But in any case, it is a mark of greatness if you are misquoted.
Thank you very much, Susan. Patrick, one quick comment at the end.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. So first of all, about the marathon thing, it's worth remembering that there was somebody out there who had the worst day at work that any of us can possibly imagine, and then went and did it again with the Nobel Prize. Yeah. I just wonder, like, where's the line? I was thinking about the naval vessels we have in this country, the James Joyce, the Samuel Beckett, the George Bernard Shaw, and the William Butler Yeats. I'd love it if we'd invade somewhere and those four boats. You know, where do we draw the line? I think a lot of this is really fine. It's a sign, as Cliona was saying, it's a sign that we care about literature. And even if it's superficial, you know, it's like confetti at a wedding. It adds colour and then we forget about it. But that's better than the alternative.
Yes.
But is there a line that we shouldn't cross?
Thanks. That's the
smallest possible point,
yeah.
Which is just that Yeats misquotes himself deliberately in a radio broadcast. You probably know this. That is No Country for Old Men, which is one of those lines that's made many book titles and familiar to all of us. He changes in a radio broadcast in 1937 because he decides the syntax doesn't work. And he makes it, old men should quit a country where the young in one another's arms. So he deliberately misquotes himself. Perhaps one of his most famous lines. So I guess the moral would be, if he can do it, then we can.
Exactly, yeah. A testimony to his greatness. Listen, thank you very much to Tom and to Vona. This has been a marvellous panel. Great way to end up the panels. And we have, so Mary, yeah, one last, yeah.
That's one thing that Dan said. A further shore is reachable by here is up on the wall outside the room installment. And I think
right.
that would see. A further shore is reachable by here is framed, and it's on the wall installment just before you move into the Parliament building. Right. And I know that would be a quote that Seamus would be very glad to be there.
Yeah, it's a good place for it. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you both. And I have the joyous news that we now have a reception, I believe, in the card room, back to the card room. And then we'll come back here, I think, with an hour.
I love that.
5:30.
It's real.
Harper's going to
you
give
can
the keynote at 5:30.
the
So we'll see you
the
back
Yeats
here at
Country
5:30.
Antiques, which
Thank you very
is-
much.